best case scenario is that you own the formula, but it's not always feasible because that's very expensive to do. If you can do it, that's yes, because if you own that formula, you can move to a different manufacturer. So like that happens too. Like sometimes I'll be working with a client and like we're doing something, with their branding, and I say, okay, like, are you ready now to launch? Like, where is it? And they said, oh, I had to change manufacturers because for whatever reason, they weren't doing something right and I didn't like them. So now I moved to somebody else. If they own your formula, then how do you do that?
What are some, like, when you're, as a small brand, who are, or founders who are already running a small brand, what are some red flags or legal gaps they should look for that might be holding them back from scaling up? So as they're thinking about expanding into big box retailers, as they're thinking about maybe expanding internationally, maybe there's other scenarios that you think of in terms of scaling up. What are some of those, conflict moments or moments where, oh, I should really take this legal step first?
Yeah, I mean, sticking with the IP protection. So if you're expanding, then that's when you need to do an audit and see what is the IP that you have. Okay. Like, so in the beginning, you're going to do your brand name, fine. But then as you're growing, there's going to be more. There's going to be so much more that you have done, so many products that you've come out with. Maybe you have a slogan now, maybe you have a logo that you really like. And so you need, like, let's look at everything and let's see, these are the things that we should protect. There's also, I don't do patent work, but in beauty formulation, some of them can be patented. So then we look at that. Like, should you, talk to a patent attorney and let's see if this is something that, you can protect. And especially if you're going internationally, you wouldn't, trademark is only good in the US, right? So if you're going, to an international market, you need the trademark there. So you need to expand there and do that.
Talk us through that process. What does that look like?
Yeah, so that's they make it a little bit easy. I mean, it depends where you are and where you want to go, I should say. And so every country, you would need a registration. The EU is good because you could get just an EU mark, and you could be registered in the EU countries. There are, certain ways to kind of do several countries in one application. And there's different rules, like in every country has different rules. Like here you have to show use in the US, and in some countries you don't have to show use. So, so it depends. And that's a question of like, should I do it in this country? Well, what are you doing there? You have, a presence there? Are you just selling in retail there? What are the kinds of things that you're doing in this country? And then we would, determine, does it make sense for you to protect yourself there?
So in the event that a brand is shipping internationally, but isn't necessarily selling in retailers, would it behoove them to then get an international mark to the countries that they are selling into or like shipping to?
So I would ask, like, what's the revenue that is going overseas? I mean, if it's a large amount of your sales that are going to, the UK, then maybe you should, because now you do have a presence because so many people are buying from you. But if you just have, the one-off international customers throughout the year, then probably not. So it depends on the brand and what they're doing.
Got it. Okay. Can we walk back to the manufacturing conversation? Because I think this is so important. I feel like this keeps coming up recently. And so I'd love to spotlight this a little bit more. What do you typically, what's your typical process, or how do you support a client who is working with a formulator to create a formulation for them? And then do you advise typically that they own that formula outright? Do you advise against that, maybe buying that at a later point? What do you recommend?
So the best case scenario is that you own the formula, but it's not always feasible because that's very expensive to do. If you can do it, that's yes, because if you own that formula, you can move to a different manufacturer. So like that happens too. Like sometimes I'll be working with a client and like we're doing something, with their branding, and I say, okay, like, are you ready now to launch? Like, where is it? And they said, oh, I had to change manufacturers because for whatever reason, they weren't doing something right and I didn't like them. So now I moved to somebody else. If they own your formula, then how do you do that? Right? Like then you have to go to another manufacturer and like, it's just, so if you can own it, that's the best case scenario. You can't always do that. But you have to then look at what does the agreement say? Like you would have a license to use the formula. And so the ownership piece is very important to know, like what is the ownership of this formula and can I take it somewhere? What can I do with it? Do they own it outright? Sometimes it's like mixed. Sometimes like they use some of theirs and then there's like some unique things that are just, your part of your formula. So it's like, it can be different things, but you have to know what it is that you are buying and what are you paying for.
Right. And I think this is, I do know that a lot of founders, especially if they're first-time business owners, aren't aware that they're not owning the formula.
Right.
They don't know that they're signing a contract that says that the manufacturer owns the formula. And you're right. I mean, what if oftentimes, and this happens very often, where you do have to move manufacturers because for whatever reason the relationship sours or it's not a good fit or for other reasons, and then what? And I imagine, yes, it's costly to own the formula outright, but it's also potentially even more costly to try and buy it later. Like, let's say you do get successful and you're now like this manufacturer seeing that you're catching successes left and right and growing. What is that cost going to look like down the road? And it's kind of assessing that risk of, do I invest in this now or do I invest more? Probably, I imagine later down the road.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. I mean, that's something that, and if you're pre-launch, you're new. I mean, you don't think of that, or you think I can't afford to do that, or I'm just going to do, I'm just going to use this form. I'm going to do private label. And it's a risk that you take, and you have to kind of think about that if that's how you want to, start off the business.